Well, thank you very much, Dr. Nathanson. And it's a real pleasure to be here and join you today. And I would like to thank the Israeli Industrial Relations Research Association and the FES for this opportunity. Of course, a lot has already been said about the crisis, and I don't need to add any more words of introduction. I think we all understand that the COVID-19 crisis is affecting all countries around the world. And, you know, as also mentioned, it hasn't just been the direct effects of the pandemic. It has, of course, been the lockdown and containment measures that have really impacted economies and labor market. It has been those indirect effects through trade, through the blockages that have happened there in terms of supply chains. Also, you know, the lockdown effects on migration, remittances, etc. So as a result, we see a massive impact on economies and labor markets around the world. And I would like to start with saying a few words about the global scenario. And as the Deputy Regional Director said, at the ILO, we've been releasing a series of what we call the ILO Monitor. And we released the 6th edition in September, the 23rd of September. And we have been focusing on the impact of the crisis in these editions. And in particular, we've been looking at how the crisis is translated into working hour losses. And I have to stress at the outset, a real challenge for us as well has been looking at quantifying the impact of the crisis. It is very difficult because of the lack of data, and we've developed a new approach to do that. And for those who are interested, can find more details in the Monitor series. But let me just stress what these pieces of work and analysis show. In particular, we find that the working hour losses in the second quarter of 2020 were around 17.3%, almost, or equivalent to almost 500 million jobs. We also find that global labor income in the first 3 quarters of this year declined by almost 11%, or the equivalent of around $3.5 trillion US. Now, what is also clear, and I won't go through the whole figure that you have in front of you, but you can see that the lower middle income countries have been hit hardest, where the working hour losses have exceeded 23% in the second quarter. And as you also may be aware from the discussions in the news and the media, etc., the Americas is the region that has been the most affected. And we see that in these estimates as well, where working hour losses fell by 28% in that region in the second quarter. Now, as also already been mentioned, this crisis is affecting certain sectors and certain groups worse than others. And in terms of sectors, of course, it's those service sectors that have been very badly affected due to the lockdown and containment measures. So accommodation and food services, retail, etc. Even more so than manufacturing, where in some countries we now are seeing some recovery in manufacturing, most notably in East Asia. But at the same time, as the Deputy Regional Director, specific groups have been hard hit. Youth, of course, youth are always affected more in crises, but this time they've also been worse affected because of also the disruptions to education and training, not just in the labor market. Women is another key group that needs to be looked at, because we see very strong effects on them in this crisis. In addition, of course, all those in the informal economy, those without those protections and support have been very vulnerable to this crisis. Going away from those working hour losses, I'm presenting here on this slide the decline in employment from the second quarter of 2019 to the second quarter of 2020. Now, I didn't explain why the modeling assumptions, etc., in the first slide, but a real issue had been that we didn't have enough data on all these types of indicators early on in the crisis. Now, as the crisis has developed, we are getting more data from labor force surveys. And so this figure is showing the results from labor force surveys on the decline in employment. And here we see the decline for both women in blue and men in red. And we see, particularly in the Americas at the bottom of the graph, massive declines in employment year on year from the second quarter of 2019 to the second quarter of 2020, where, in many of those countries, it's been well over 25%. In Peru, I should note, that is a figure just for Lima and the metropolitan area. But these are very catastrophic numbers, right? I have highlighted Israel, where the data that we have in the ILO stat shows a smaller decline in employment. But as Dr. Nathanson mention, there are other indicators in the labor market that show different changes, and including that rise in temporary absences from employment, which are not captured in these numbers. And I would also stress that, the latest labor force survey data is telling us that many of these people who have been hit hard in terms of the decline in employment are getting picked up in inactivity rather than unemployment. That is also a very unique feature of this crisis because, people are losing jobs, are out of employment, but they're unable to search for jobs or they're not available for jobs because of the lockdown and containment measures. You see that in the case of Israel, but you can see that in the case of all these countries. And I refer you to the 6th ILO monitor for further details on this. And this is also a very important issue to monitor. Part of it is a definitional issue because people are not being classified as unemployed, they're classified as inactivity. But we need to monitor that very carefully over time to see what actually happens to those people, whether they are losing their attachment to the labor force. Now, this gives you a picture of what's happened early in the year in the crisis, the second quarter working hour losses I've mentioned, what the labor force survey is telling us about employment decline. But what we need to also remember is that, of course, we are really still in the middle of this crisis. And even going back to September, our projections for the rest of the year indicated, continuing impact of the crisis on the labor market. So in the fourth quarter, we were expecting a decline in working hour losses of still around 8.6%, equivalent to 250 full-time jobs around the world. But really, even since that was done, just around a month ago, or the data coming a bit earlier than that, we've seen a further deterioration in a number of countries, of course, as we see the resurgence in the virus and new lockdown measures. And I'm sure when we redo these projections in our next edition, which will come out most likely early next year, we will see if, that this is further deteriorated. So, this is a really important point. The crisis continues. The recovery is slow, painful, and uncertain. Now, as I've mentioned, it's these resurgence of the virus and ongoing or new lockdown measures continue to impact economies. And I'm not, important caveat, I have not analyzed the situation in Israel in any great depth, so I'm open to any corrections or any insights that you all have. But of course, as you know very well, the lockdown measures in Israel were reimposed back in September. You see this in the Oxford government response tracker indicators, which are used by many, including us at the ILO, as an important input into this modeling exercise that gives us these results on working hour losses. So this is something, of course, and this is happening in other countries now, of course, in Europe as well. Now, what we see is the lockdown leads, of course, to lower consumption because people are unable to get out. People are reluctant to spend. We see precautionary savings have increased in many countries around the world. And interestingly, we see this in the Google mobility trends. And, in the case of Israel, if you look at the latest Google mobility trends, the mobility in places of retail and recreation are down 53% on the baseline prior to the crisis. And you see that effect of the lockdown. You'll see this in most countries. And, in addition to this Oxford stringency indicator that I just showed you in the previous slide, this is also a very important piece of information to see what is actually happening in real time. And that has been a very important lesson from this crisis. We've had to resort to new indicators to get a better understanding of the impact of the crisis. In a slow-moving crisis, you wait for your labor force survey data, you see what's happened, you analyze it, etc. This crisis has been so fast-moving and so complex and changing, we've had to resort to new indicators to get a better understanding. And I'm just giving you a snapshot of this. Now, this session is not going into details, I think, about all the policy measures. Dr. Nathanson talked about policy already, and I know the other sessions will go over this as well. But let me just, to conclude, I just will stress the following 5 points. We've seen a massive stimulus around the world, and it's still playing a crucial role. And the latest figures from the IMF indicate that this is at around $11.7 trillion, or almost 12% of global GDP. This is far greater than what we saw in the global financial crisis. So there's been a very strong commitment by governments to use fiscal stimulus and, of course, also accommodative monetary policy. Now, of course, there are many questions about what actually gets implemented and what's the effects, and that needs to be looked at carefully in any country. But I would also stress the following. As we continue this very uncertain and complex path, we will need to continue to balance and sequence the health and economic and employment social policy interventions. This is not a one or the other. There's a need to balance them, looking at the sequencing as well over time. And, you know, we would stress, as our Director General did in our last, the release of the last monitor, premature loosening of health measures risks prolonging the pandemic. And our own analysis shows this would worsen the overall labor market impact. Now, we've seen a lot of support for jobs and labor income around the world. And what we're stressing is that this will need to continue well into 2021 to keep employment, businesses, and incomes afloat. But at the same time, as we move to recovery, we have to think about adapting support for growing and target sectors. A lot of talk is there around the green economy, the digital economy, care economy. Now, you know, it's easier said than done, and this requires careful targeting of measures. And really, as we move to recovery, increase our focus on public investment is also absolutely critical to support this recovery process. I would stress also that the income support for vulnerable and hard-hit groups, including women, young women, people, informal workers, should remain a priority, while strengthening the social protection system for greater resilience. Now, as a final word, and this is of course, very relevant to today's discussion, given the complexity of these challenges, social dialogue has remained, has a key role to play. And ILO, of course, brings these issues together in its our work. And from my side, in the work we do, it's through employment policy approaches at the country level, including the assessments and policy advisory services we are giving. And that's all from my side. It's been, you know, I really, you know, like to thank the organizers for this opportunity. I'm leaving a few links and some further resources for those who are interested, including the country level work we do on employment around on the crisis. So thank you very much, Chair, and it's been a real pleasure to join this session.